close to him now. We've already met a time or two since I moved to Atlanta. And so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have you here and give a talk on research that is also relative close to my own interests. So Eric has a very interesting past. Not very many professors of transportation can say they were a former sports writer or travel writer and a TV script writer. The TV script, he wrote the script for Star Trek.
Did Star Trek Voyager?
Star Trek Voyager. Oh,
Xena.
Wow, so, you know, Xena? So how cool is that? How cool is that? So he's written for the New York Times, a regular column at one point, and contributed to the Freakonomics blog. So he's really quite the cool character, I would say. And I will stop there and give you the chance to tell us what's on your mind. And thank you very much for coming.
So I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me today. To talk about a favorite topic of mine. The provocative title of my talk is Travel Really That Bad? We're going to focus today on travel and happiness, which is a subject that hopefully is of great interest to everybody sitting in this room. It's been of great interest to human thinkers going all the way back in the history of thought. So, stretching back to our earliest records of human inquiry, the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, people are already asking the question, what does it mean to be happy, and how can we lead a happier life? The exciting thing today is that thanks to modern data gathering, statistical techniques, computer processing power, we're now finally getting empirical answers to questions that have been confined to the realm of philosophy for literally thousands of years. So people have speculated on what makes us happy before, but now we can actually figure out what does seem to make people happy. And as a result of this, interest in happiness has been exploding in a number of disciplines. So economists are really interested in it. Obviously, psychologists have focused on it a lot. Sociology, other social science-related fields. However, happiness research has come somewhat late, in my opinion, to the field of transportation planning and the field of urban and city planning, which is the department that I'm in. Fortunately, this is now being rectified, and people are paying more attention to this topic. A major pioneer in this field was Pat Malkarian, who's sitting right here. Pat, I think, has a real knack for asking very interesting questions, and so I'm investigating a couple of different things that she's worked on in the past. But for a while, Pat's research sort of stuck out like a sore thumb. There were a few others who were doing research on travel and happiness, but for the most part, there wasn't that much work out there. And when I first became interested in the topic, there would not be a single talk at TRB about the subject of travel and happiness, or travel and well-being more broadly. But this is now being rectified. Every year at TRB, there's now a session on this, maybe even 2 sessions. We have a review paper out that came out in 2013. The bad news is that the conclusion of the review paper is that, there's still so much research that needs to be done. But the good news is we do have the critical mass to actually merit a review paper in this field. Now, I would maintain that it's pretty obvious that happiness is something we should be interested in as transportation planners, engineers, people who furnish transportation resources. Because if we're not planning for happiness, it's hard to see what we're planning for. Now, we tend to look at a lot of intermediate outcomes, like can we reduce congestion, can we improve air quality, can we improve public health, can we walk more, things like that. But ultimately, isn't the bottom line making people happy? I can imagine interventions that we might want to do that might make some people unhappy. So maybe we want to make people in the present a little less happy so that people in the future can be more happy. But still the goal is sustainability, but still the goal is to make somebody happy. Ultimately, improving human well-being is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to do. So if we're not providing transportation to people to make them happy, I'm not exactly sure what we're providing for. Before we start, I want to delineate a couple of concepts. And the first of which is how happiness relates to the broader concept of utility, which is basically the total benefit reaped from an activity. This can come in a variety of ways. So when we travel, we get benefits from the activity in terms of the benefits we reap at the destination. That's a really major one, right? We go to school so that we can learn. That trip has gotten us a lot of learning. Happiness is a more narrow concept, in a way, that is typically broken down into three distinct but interrelated components. One of them is life satisfaction. And life satisfaction is the sum total of the quality of people's lives. Philosophers, going way back in happiness history, used to think that the way to figure out whether people are happy or not is to philosophize about how people should live their lives and then hold them up to this ruler to see if they actually live that way. So Aristotle had a long list of things that a happy person should be. And incidentally, a lot of them we would find obnoxious today. A happy person should be look down on his inferiors and never lower himself to be nice to them, things like that. Nowadays, the way we measure life satisfaction is just ask people if they're happy or not. Nowadays, we assume that it's up to people to decide for themselves what makes them happy. Anyway, life satisfaction is not going to be what I'm talking about today. I have done other research on transportation resources and life satisfaction, so like does owning a car make you a happier person, etc. What I'm going to focus on today is called affect. And affect is your immediate mood while you're doing an activity. So, do you feel cranky? Do you feel tired? Do you feel elated? Your immediate emotions. Now, utility includes the affect you're doing while you're participating in that activity, because it is one of the costs and benefits of the activity. So, a really unpleasant trip, for example, detracts from the total benefits that you are reaping from that trip. But it's not the only factor that goes into the utility, because as I said earlier, you're getting other benefits. A trip might be very unpleasant. You might not like commuting to work in horrible traffic. You might be unhappy while you're doing it. But still, that trip brings you a lot of benefits, such as the fact that you don't get fired from work. Positive and negative affect are divided into two separate categories, because they are, to an extent, independent constructs that can vary independently, covary independently, very independently. So it is possible for one person to be in a good mood and a bad mood more than another person. So someone might be on an even keel and always have a neutral mood, and another person might have more of a tendency to go like this. However, it's very unusual for people to feel positive and negative affect at any given time. So rarely happy and sad simultaneously. So in this research, we're going to amalgamate positive and negative affect into a single variable. We'll talk about that later. I just talked about all of this. So yeah, some activities might have high utility but be unpleasant, such as work. People generally in happiness surveys report that they're very unhappy while working, but yet work is one of the highest value activities we do. That's why we get there religiously. Other activities we might not do all the time, but work will always get there because of the very high benefits. TV watching is one of the happiest activities, unsurprisingly. Americans do it. I think the figure is on average about 2.5 hours a day. But that has lower utility because you don't get any, larger incremental I talk about utility because, as many of you in this room probably know, the study of utility and travel goes way back. And we use, as planners and engineers, what are called random utility models to figure out what characteristics of individuals are going to affect their mode and route choices. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with the statistics, the multinomial logit model was actually invented for the purposes of transportation, specifically to project ridership on the BART network. And it was found to be incredibly accurate, much more accurate than the other methods that they were using to forecast ridership. And as a result, this multinomial logit model gained currency. I don't have time to be making diversions from my talk, but I'm going to anyway. Apparently what happened is the logit model had a flaw that made the results wrong, but it had another flaw that counteracted it and made the results sound right. Have you heard this story? So supposedly it was like two errors cancel each other out, and that's what made everyone think that it was like brilliantly accurate. This is according to the guy who said. In any event, I'm not going to talk about the RUM findings too much. One important one in our case is that utility models find that people like to minimize the amount of time they spend traveling. Not hugely shocking finding. In general, we don't want to spend more time traveling than we have to. But it's unclear whether this is because people find travel unpleasant or because of the opportunity cost of travel. So you don't like to travel too long because you could be doing other stuff that will bring you other benefits, but we're not clear if it's because travel itself is not fun. The research I'm going to present to you today, and that Dr. Makarian works in as well, I think is a good complement to random utility modeling. We already know a lot about people and travel through random utility modeling, but observing happiness has some benefits. Now, the good thing about random utility modeling is that it's a revealed preference form of study. So in general, economists like it better. They think it's a better way to find out what people want by observing what they choose and what they actually do than by just asking them what they want. You just ask them what they want, other things they might tell the interviewer what they think the interviewer wants to hear, etc. And I love revealed preference study. And that's what random utility modeling is. However, there are disadvantages that make it profitable to do what are called stated preference surveys, so asking people how happy they are. One of them, for example, is that if we observe two travel choices, take the bus or take a car, and we make them both more appealing, it might not affect people's choices at all. We can only compare bus and car. We have a hard time comparing bus and car to other stuff to know if they're now both more appealing in relation to washing the dishes. That's another advantage of this study, is that with random utility modeling, it's very difficult to compare travel with other stuff like washing the dishes or watching television. By asking people about their happiness, we can do that and see how travel fits in to the broader spectrum of human activity. Another good thing I think about this research is that people can relate to it. So the research I'm going to present to you today got a lot of media attention, and I think a big part of it is because it talks about happiness. And everyone can understand, oh, X and such, I won't spoil the talk for you, is the happiest mode. And, write about it in their magazines where it's like, oh, we found the, utility, here's the results of our multinomial logit model of, route choice. That's a little bit harder to get your head around. So there's my justifications for doing this kind of study. Hold on here. Okay. The research questions for the study today come from seeking an answer to the question, is travel really that bad? Now I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but in general it's assumed that travel is what's called a derived demand. We don't travel for the sake of traveling, we travel because we need to get somewhere. And as such, we generally assume, pretty much always assume, that people try to minimize the amount of traveling that they are doing. And so our transportation demand modeling assumes that travel time is a negative that people try to minimize. And as we've seen from random utility modeling, in general, this is true. I'm not going to try to overturn this perspective. We all know that, in general, we want to get there fast. No one wants to spend 24 hours a day traveling. We have other stuff we need to do. But what I'd like to suggest is that maybe we can take a more nuanced view of this phenomenon. Let's disaggregate the things that go into traveling and try to figure out what exactly it is that's bringing us costs and bringing us benefits. And there are a number of potential benefits we can get from looking at things this way. I'm going to suggest a couple of policy suggestions at the end of this talk that try to capitalize on what we can learn by knowing about the emotions of travelers and how to make travelers' emotions feel better, improve. So the research questions that I'm going to look at are, number one, is travel associated with low affect? So are people in a bad mood while traveling? If travel is a derived demand, we only do it because we have to, we might assume that traveling is unfun, but hey, maybe it isn't. We'll investigate that. Second of all, I'm going to disaggregate by mode. So we're going to look at car driver, car passenger, pedestrians, bicyclists, train subway riders, and bus riders, and we're going to see who the happiest are. Okay, show of hands. Who thinks car drivers are the happiest travelers? Nobody in this room? Okay, car passenger? A couple people, okay. Pedestrian, walker? I can see it's a good green travel partner. Bicyclist? Some of you, okay. Train subway rider? Couple, how about bus rider? No one raises their hand for bus. All right, keep in mind what you voted for at the end. There will be a special prize for you if you get it right. But we'll have to see who's right. Oh, and also I'm going to tack on some recent research I've done about happiness and duration. So are we happier on longer trips than on shorter trips or vice versa? And maybe very briefly, if you remind me, it's not on my slide, so if I send you away without telling you, remind me, trip purpose and happiness on the trip. I'm going to go very quickly through prior research in the interest of time, except to note that overall, a number of authors have explored the positive feelings we get from traveling. And as I mentioned, I won't repeat myself over and over, but Dr. Martarian is a real pioneer in this and was saying, working with various collaborators, was one of the early people to be exploring this issue. We suspect that there's good stuff to be had while traveling, because there's lots of kinds of travel we do just for fun, right? We go skiing, or we go on roller coasters, or we do hiking, or lots of different forms of travel, ride motorcycles recreationally, etc. Now, this is not to suggest that your ordinary workaday trip to the grocery store is as fun as going skiing. Obviously, it isn't. But it does suggest that there might be aspects of skiing that we do enjoy during our more regular humdrum workaday travel. And people have speculated about what these are. So, number one is a feeling of autonomy and a sense of mastery. So, when we go out, we're conquering the outside world in a way. We're overcoming obstacles. We feel good about ourselves because we're overcoming these things. We're getting where we're going, and we feel a sense of accomplishment as a result. Another thing might be feelings of status. That's kind of related to what I just talked about. Another thing might be the thrill of speed and adventure. So most of the recreational sorts of travel involve some sort of going fast. I'm going to speculate, I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but there seems to be some sort of thrill of traveling at high speeds and feeling like you're in danger, but knowing you're not in danger, that people seem to enjoy. Another thing might be novelty. So if you think about it, most of our lives, though they may be enjoyable or not, are very cosseted. We're in very controlled environments where nothing is surprising, or not nothing surprising, but there's a tendency for not too many surprising things to happen. When you're out in the world, it's one of the few times that your environment is very unpredictable and you don't know exactly what's going to go on. Satisfaction of curiosity and aesthetic enjoyment might be other things that people enjoy. So you get to look out your window and look at the scenery. Another thing might be escape. This is something that Dr. Martarian has looked at when she's done research on commuting. So a lot of people report that they like their commute, as long as it's of moderate duration. I think we can agree that few people like really long, really grueling commutes. But it is possible, and indeed, according to some research, probable, that people enjoy aspects of their commute. And if you ask a lot of people, they'll say, my commute is the only time I have to myself. I can chill out, I can listen to the radio, especially working parents who have family demands and work demands and are constantly under the gun. They can just veg out when they're in the car and have some me time. I have a 45-minute commute, fairly long, especially by the standards of Greenville, South Carolina, where there's no traffic and everything's really close together. Most days I really enjoy it, because it's the only time I don't have to be working or feeling guilty that I'm not working. There's no way I can be productive, and no one can force me to be productive, so I really enjoy it. Finally, there's stuff you can do while you're traveling, right? So you can listen to the radio, or listen to books on tape, or talk on the telephone, things like that. So if we want to know if people like travel, why don't we ask them? And that's what Dr. Martarian did. So she did a survey in 2001, and 32% of the sample said they like short distance travel. Short distance meaning not like travel to Disneyland, but within your city. And only 13% said they disliked it. The rest were neutral. Nearly 70% disagreed with the statement that the only good thing about traveling is arriving at your destination. And only 20% disagreed with the statement that getting there is half the fun. So if you just ask people, they say that they enjoy travel, or at least enjoy many aspects of it. Now, this is just a survey, it's descriptive statistics. But I once heard a scholar named Nate Baum-Snow say that all the fancy econometrics in the world is just a robustness test for the descriptive statistics. It's one of my favorite aphorisms of all time. So just on the face of it, it definitely seems like people kind of like travel. There's been a bunch of research on the commute. As is common in travel research, people focus a lot on the commute, maybe disproportionately if you really look at the percentage of people's trips that are commuting. And results have come in across the board. So Kahneman and Kruger, by the way, Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner in happiness economics. He's like one of the deans, along with Ed Diener, of this field. He looked at 19 different activities and found that the morning and evening commutes are the 17th and 19th least happy activities. Work is the 18th least happy. Intimate relations, quote unquote, is the #1 happiest activity. Perhaps no surprise there. Another study, though, by a series of European researchers who are also, I won't read all their names, but they're also pioneers on travel and happiness, find that subjects are relatively happy while commuting. And White and Dolan, who are also prominent happiness researchers, they found that the commute was sort of in the middle. So they found it's more enjoyable than work or housework, but less enjoyable than exercise or television or eating, and that the commute is about on a par with cooking, shopping, and time spent with children. So what's my answer? You just have to hang on, I'll get to it in a second. In terms of mode, the Martarian and Solomon survey found that walking and cycling were the most popular modes, with 2/3 of the people saying they really enjoy it, and only 9% of the people saying they don't enjoy it. The majority of the sample expressed the wish that they would walk and bicycle more. Auto travel was also quite popular, with about 58% saying they like it, and 10% saying they dislike it. Train, subway, light rail travel was less popular, with about equal numbers of people saying they like it as dislike it. Bus travel was extremely unpopular, with 63% saying they dislike it, and 8% saying they like it. To generalize from a body of research, I think there is a reasonable consensus that in the United States, given our current transit system and land use patterns and how they interact, that auto travel is more popular than transit travel. And a number of scholars have tried to speculate about why, and without going into all the reasons individually, I think it has to do with, they can be grouped into two major things. #1 is on transit, you're not in control. You're not in control of where the vehicle goes, you're not in control of the schedule. You're not in control of how long it waits at stops. You're not in control of your personal space. Who knows who might sit next to you, maybe it's somebody that you don't like. So you don't have that sense of autonomy and mastery that you have when you're in that private vehicle. And then the other group of reasons, it has to do with personal comfort. So the seat in the car is more comfortable, the climate control is something you can control, the stereo is something that you can control. The biggest one is that you never have to stand in your car, and you might have to stand on transit, which can be grueling if it's a long, difficult trip. Okay, I'll go past that. In terms of mood and trip duration, Hupkes, who was a very interesting, very early theorist about the travel time budget theory, And that theory basically says that people have it sort of hardwired into them to travel a certain amount of time in the day. Again, Dr. Martirian beat me to this by many years, but I referred you to her excellent review of the travel time budget. Fascinating theory, I think. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, it's hard to say. But in any event, his theory is that trips start off as fun and then get tiresome, burdensome. And he kind of thinks that this is one of the reasons that people might tend to travel a certain amount, because they like trips at first, they do a certain number of them, but they get tired of those trips, so that caps the ultimate amount of time that they spend traveling. A number of studies have looked at trip duration and the commute. Several studies, including one of my own, has found that people with longer commutes have lower life satisfaction than people with shorter commutes. A number of other studies have looked at commute duration and satisfaction with the commute. So do people who have long commutes like their commute better? And the consensus is that they don't. The longer the commute, the less people like the commute. It's unclear, though, the extent to which this is because the actual trip puts you in a certain mood, or just because you don't like that time is being taken away from other activities. One study that I thought was interesting finds marital separation rates are higher for long-distance commuters. Another study found that travelers, on the whole, would ideally be spending 30% less time commuting. But as I mentioned earlier, there have been other people who have found that there are benefits to the commute, and the Redmond and Mokhtarian survey found that on average, people prefer a 16-minute commute, and that very few people said that they would teleport to work if it were possible. And that kind of gives us the idea that maybe there are benefits to having that transition zone between home and work. Another study found that 20 to 25 minutes is the inflection point where people stop wishing their commute was longer and start wishing their commute was shorter. Another study found that almost half the people are satisfied with the length of their commute. A set of other studies have looked at stress during commuting, and just to go over this quickly, they find that there is higher stress levels associated with longer commutes. In addition to just asking people if they're stressed, which is what the research today does, they have medical tests to see if people have elevated salivary cortisol levels that would indicate that they're more stressed out. Another study has found that people with longer commutes have higher tension, nervousness, and higher blood pressure. Anyway, so there have been studies showing that longer trips involve more stress and less positive emotions. So what do I find? I totally forgot. I did this research with Eric Guerra of the University of Pennsylvania. He's a wonderful researcher. I didn't mean to try to hog all the credit today. Our data is drawn from the American Time Use Survey. It's a really terrific data source. As you can guess from the title, it asks how people spend their time. It's done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau, and it gets into really fine, really precise detail about what people do in their day. It breaks time use into like 463 categories, I think. So it's got very obscure categories of time use. So we know how much time people spend fencing or caving. It's a really great data set. And there are 70 different categories of travel based on trip purpose. They also break it down by all of the modes. And they also include who you were doing the activity with at the time. The well-being model, and I'm doing other research out of this data set that I'd love to talk to you about some other time. In 2011, the Time Use Survey did a well-being module where they sampled 3 activities from each respondent in their day, and they asked them about a battery of emotions that they may or may not have been feeling. So they surveyed 13,000 and change people for this well-being module, and because there was 3 activities per day, we observed about 38,000 activities total. So 13,000 people, 38,000 activities. It's a pretty robust sample size, and everything has a fighting chance at achieving statistical significance, which is good. In terms of our choice of models, I'm going to present 2 different types of modeling today. I don't know how familiar with econometrics people are in this room today. So we do pooled OLS, ordinary least squares regression, something you learn in basic statistics, probably you all are familiar with it. And then we also did a fixed effects panel regression, taking advantage of the fact that we have 3 observations per person. So the models tell us different things, so I want to try to explain them clearly. The OLS takes all of the activities, groups them together, and says, are the people who are traveling happier or less happy than the people who are not traveling? So travelers as a group, happy versus unhappy. The fixed effects panel regression looks at each individual and compares their 3 activities. So if a person traveled and watched television and did cooking, it looks at their travel score and their activity score and their cooking score and whatever else I said that they're doing. And what it tells us is, and I'm definitely not simplifying this absolutely correctly, but I'll do it just for comprehensibility purposes. So what this tells us is for the average person, are they happier while they're traveling when they're doing their other activities? And I'll explain later the implications of how they tell us different things in our findings. We like the fixed effects panel regression better, if we had to choose, because it in effect controls for more. So in the OLS, we controlled for all the usual suspects of demographics and all that. So we controlled for age, income, marital status, employment. We controlled for location, so city versus suburb versus rural area. We controlled for living in New York. We did this because New York is a hugely disproportionate share of transit travel in the United States, like 40%, I think, of transit trips. And we didn't want to find that transit travelers are cranky because New Yorkers are cranky. not to insult New Yorkers, but so we control for lots of stuff. But there's lots of stuff we didn't control for because you can't observe everything about people when you give them a survey. And the fixed effects model, in effect, controls for all of that because it's the same person who's doing all 3 responses to the question. So when you compare his or her responses, the only thing that's going to differ about that person is stuff that happened to them on the survey day. So maybe in the hours between the responses, something happened and they're in a different mood, but all their basic intrinsic characteristics are going to be the same. This is good because the number one thing we don't observe that would be of great importance is this. And I have some bad news and good news to give you guys about happiness today. You're going to find some of the all-time secrets of happiness. You thought you were coming to a boring transportation talk. I'm going to tell you how to be happy, the secret to happiness. But the bad news is, studies have found that in terms of life satisfaction, between 1/3 and 1/2 of your life satisfaction is genetic and inherited, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that is something we don't observe in the OLS, but it is controlled for in effect in the fixed effects panel model. Of the remaining 1/2 to 66% of happiness, a lot of that stuff is out of your control. So your physical health. Now, you can make yourself healthier by living right, but also a lot of it is just pure luck, so you can't control that either. But I'm going to tell you coming up what you can control. In any event, we observed 5 different emotions. So happiness was our measure of positive affect, and sad, tired, stressed, and in pain were our 4 negative emotions. And we combined these into a single emotion factor, variable, using 2 different things. One of them is you average negative affect variables and then subtract them from the average of positive affect variables, which is done in the literature. We also use factor analysis to create a latent variable for mood and take those 5 variables and boil them down, in a sense, into one. As a robustness test, and it really made no major difference. Another thing we had to do is correct for skew. So this is some good news about happiness. Basically, if you ask people if they're happy or not, stretching across cultures, across countries, all over the world, most people say they're happy. So like in the US, if you just say happy, yes or no, 85% say they're happy. So that is good. We can't there's a limited amount we can do to control our happiness, but most people in this world are happy, and that's a good thing. How do you make yourself more happy? I promised I would tell you. Perhaps the thing that's most in your control is to have low expectations and no ambition. You laugh, but I've read it to be true. I don't know for sure. But if you expect the worst, then you're never going to be disappointed with what you get. You laugh, but don't the Buddhists say that the causes of suffering are ignorance and desire? Desire is the cause of suffering. So if you're unambitious and don't desire things, then you're going to be happier. Now, that's controlling for income. Another thing about happiness research I'll tell you is money can buy happiness. So to the extent that ambition makes you more money, then it's good, but controlling for money, better to have low ambition. Anyway, I guess inheriting a lot of money is the best thing to do, so that's another tip for how to be happy. Be sure you inherit a lot of money. Anyway, we had to do transformations of the variables to correct for Steve, if you don't really care. I'm going to skip over the results, and we're running low on time already, and get to the takeaways. All the results that you need to know are in here. Number one, the majority of what makes you happy is not observed in this study and doesn't have a tremendous amount to do with whether you're traveling or not, or indeed your activity in general. We were surprised by how little what you're doing affects your mood. It did, and we definitely found a lot of statistically significant results. But in our OLS, the R-squared is about 140, 0.14. Is this a good or bad R-squared? Everyone asks that in statistics class, and you'll be told, oh, well, it depends, you know. When looking at individual behavior, you expect lower R-squareds. This isn't terrible, but still there's lots that goes into people's happiness that we fail to observe. The row and the panel models show that 2/3 of the variation is explained by the fixed effects, leaving only 1/3 left over to be explained by the things that vary, such as the activities on the study. We find that overall, travel is not unenjoyable. It's kind of a medium activity, the way someone else, White and Dolan's research said it was. It is less happy than things like socializing or religious activities, but more happy than things like work and housework. In the OLS, we actually found that travel is significantly happier than the mean of activities in general. Travel is actually somewhat above average. Not a lot. We have a big sample, and we had a t-statistic of like 2.4, and that's not big with a big sample. Anyway, it is statistically significantly higher than the mean. However, in the fixed effects, what we find is that it's about at the mean. Now, there's not a big difference, but to the extent that there is, and it says that there is, what it suggests is that if travelers as a group are somewhat happier than non-travelers, and yet if people are about as happy while they're traveling as when they're doing their other stuff, it suggests that travelers as a group are intrinsically happier people and are self-selected into traveling. In other words, happier people travel more, or more likely to travel. And we find this a plausible finding. Maybe happier people end up more get up and go, and they don't mope around the house or whatever unhappy people do, and they get out and do more stuff. Maybe getting out of the house and doing more stuff makes you happier, and some of that bleeds over into the time you spend traveling. Anyway, it suggests we should revisit the assumption that travel time is an unalloyed source of unhappiness. We might also want to, in future research, examine what factors make travel pleasant and unpleasant, with an eye towards improving our travel demand modeling by including some of these factors. So, if we find that enjoyment of the scenery is important, we might want to load more traffic onto our links that run through areas that are more physically attractive. One is not a statistically significant sample size, hopefully you learned that in statistics, but based on one person's experience, when I lived in LA, I always took Beverly Glen over the hill to use LA and never took the 405. Even though the 405 might have been faster, but Beverly Glen is much more attractive and much more fun driving, and so I was gladly willing to take on a few extra minutes of travel for a more fun and pleasant trip. We might want to investigate this. We might even want to investigate the degree to which the desire to travel might in some cases motivate our desire to actually undertake the activity. So, in most cases, I don't want to try to overturn obvious wisdom we need stuff from the store and that's why we go to the store. But on Saturday night, don't you sometimes find yourself going, let's get out of the house. We gotta go somewhere and do something. Okay, what should we do? Should we check the newspaper, the movie listings, or let's figure out where this travel is going to lead to? So we might want to investigate the amount that desire for travel in and of itself contributes to our travel behavior. Happiest mood, who said bicycling? You're right. Bicycling was by far the happiest mode. The only thing that makes the story a little less satisfying is we didn't observe a lot of utilitarian bicycling. We left out all the purely recreational travel. So we didn't look at people just out hiking and biking for its own sake. And not too many people bicycle to get to work or to get to the store or things like that. So we only observed like 36 cases out of 38,000 activities. But such was the magnitude of the coefficient parameters that, estimates of the parameters, that it still came out statistically significantly higher than some of the other modes. So it beat out walking and bus in terms of happiness. Very large effects. This got a lot of media attention. I got called from all sorts of bicycling, fitness magazines. A lot of people were excited to hear about this result. A lot of people ask me why I think this is the case. And I was talking about this earlier with Karen. I don't know anything about anything, and I don't own a bicycle. So what position am I? But that didn't, I have a PhD, that gives me the right to say whatever I want about anything and have people believe me. So a couple of theories. I think there's probably some fun on a bicycle to feeling like you're in danger but knowing you're not in danger. Like going on a roller coaster or like jumping out of an airplane. It's sort of, you're precariously balanced, etc. I think probably from the physical exercise you get some sort of endorphin rush going. I think you probably get a sense of satisfaction out of doing something different. So it's a fairly difficult travel mode to keep yourself on a bike, and your car's going by and whatever, and you probably feel when you're done bicycling that you've accomplished something, overcome barriers, and feel better about yourself. There may have been a couple more. I was just making these up this morning, in fact. Anyway, what does this suggest? Well, maybe we should think more about promoting bicycling. It's an uphill slog in the United States. The bicycling share is very small. But people who have been to Davis, California know it can be a lot higher. People who have been to Amsterdam or Copenhagen know it can be super high. So perhaps there are things we could do in the United States to make people bicycle more. This is not to suggest that bicycling is for everyone. Obviously, many people are not going to get on a bike no matter what. But there are probably people at the margin of biking who just fall over the bike or not bike divide. And if we could accommodate them a little bit better, perhaps we could get more people to take part in this apparently enjoyable as well as healthy and sustainable, other good things to be said about both. We actually found walkers were kind of unhappy. And this surprised me. I thought that walkers would be happier. Dr. Markarian's study found that walkers are happy. The only thing I can say about this finding is that I suspect that walking masks a wide variety of different types of walk. And the mood score for walking had the highest standard deviation of any of the modes. So it had the biggest range of emotions for walking compared to other modes. I suspect it has to do with the fact, and again, I have no empirical basis. In a future paper, I hope to get one. I suspect it's because, for example, people who don't own a car and have to walk might be looking at a lot of unpleasant journeys. Long trips, in the elements, in perhaps dangerous neighborhoods, schlepping kids or packages or whatever. Whereas for discretionary walkers who have cars or other means of transportation, who could take those other means, but only walk when it's a short trip, a pleasant trip, good weather, they might have more satisfaction with walking than others. Anyway, we'll have to look at this in a future paper. Transit comes out pretty bad. So in the OLS, train, subway, light rail riding was the unhappiest mode, and in the fixed effects model, it was the bus that came out significantly lower than auto travel and biking. Some of this is due to the fact that transit is disproportionately used for the commute, which is a particularly loathed trip, even among the universe of travel. But anyway, just a little bit. So what does this suggest? Well, I guess a lot of great work is being done here at Georgia Tech about various aspects of travel and how it relates to our emotions and how we can address the emotional aspects of travel. So I won't go into huge detail, but I might just suggest that we might want to pay as much attention to the emotional downsides of transit travel as opposed to just the utilitarian ones. So yeah, we want to get people there faster, more reliably, but at the same time, we might want to make it a more pleasant trip. The example that I typically give is the next bus arrival sign at subway or bus stops. Rarely is that actually going to help you get there any faster. Typically, you're not going to walk back to your house and take your car when you see that your bus is late. Kind of, once you're at the stop, you're sort of committed to the bus. But what it does address is the very great unpleasantness of the uncertainty of knowing whether your vehicle is going to be there or not. And transit travelers really dislike this. It's one of the major things that contributes to the fact that waiting time is so much more onerous than in-vehicle time. And at least that sign gives you the peace of mind so that while you're waiting for the vehicle, you don't have to be standing there the whole time going, what if it's late? What if there's an accident? What if there's congestion upstream? I've got to be at this job interview at 11 o'clock, etc. So, and that's those signs are very cost effective. So it may be difficult for us to build a bus lane to make the buses go faster, but it might be a lot easier to address some of the emotional downsides through things like that. Finally, almost finally, we found that auto travel is kind of a medium to medium happy mode. And we found auto passenger and driver are basically indistinguishable from each other. We were interested in this because we're interested in self-driving cars. And we're curious to know if people like being a passenger and being driven around better than they like driving. And as it turns out, we can't say that one or the other is any happier or not. So it may be that in the aggregate, people are not going to be necessarily thrilled to not be chauffeured around. And finally, we find that long trips are associated with worse mood. They are associated with more stress, more fatigue, more sadness, especially trying by bus and bicycle are modes that for longer trips they become very unpleasant. And we did not find significance for a quadratic term. It's a linear relationship with longer trips and lower happiness. Finally, I mean, what this leads to is the policy recommendation that making trips shorter would make people happier, but on the other hand, how do we make trips shorter? That's what we all try to do all day long as transportation planners and engineers. What do we do about congestion? That's a tough question. So I don't have great policy recommendations for that. Anyway, this is what I found out about happiness and travel. Giving this talk to you today has raised my happiness level by the log of the factor of my emotional level by 0.02, and that's a significant amount. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing my talk as well, and I'll open up to questions now if anyone has anything they want to ask about. Yes, sir.
Did your New Yorker ever show up in any of the mojo?
That's an excellent question. It was not for the mojo, so for happiness levels.
Yeah.
Our New Yorker's less happy. We might all know from anecdotal experiences that they might be a little gruff. There might be a different way of dealing with people. We did not find that they were significantly less happy. They were a little bit less happy, but t-statistic of like -1.4 to the best of my recollection. Yes, sir?
Going based off of the New York question, did you find the shares of happiness level between modes different in New York than in other places?
We didn't do it by interacting. We didn't interact the New York variable. I was just talking this morning with Dr. Mokhtarian about follow-ups to this, which there are several we can do. We've submitted the travel time one. There's two others. The trip. Oh, for trip purpose, I forgot to mention. I told you to remind me to tell you about trip purpose. Trips to happier stuff are happier than trips to stuff that people don't want to do. We find. So that's another paper. But so we're thinking about looking at city, suburban, rural location and city size and seeing if that has a relationship with bad emotions during driving, under the presumption that like urban, big city driving is more stressful than rural driving. And we were talking this morning about, well, is city size and urban, rural, suburban really good enough proxies for frustrating driving or congestion that we can make that assumption? I mean, many of you may know, there's a strong link between city size and congestion. So in the very aggregate, it would be true, but I don't know. I'm thinking about doing it right now. And the result we found already, just from hitting this, is there doesn't seem to be a link between negative emotions and driving and city size or urban, rural, suburban. We didn't interact it with New York. Yes?
What about sex?
Ranks number 1 on the 19 best liked activities. The American Time Use Survey.
That's the way to get more people.
The American Time Use Survey does ask about intimate relations, although they won't tell you. They don't tell you who it was with or where it was done. They don't want to make people, and they don't ask where you slept either.
That wasn't my question.
He's looking for gender.
I don't remember what the parameter estimate for in this study, I'm embarrassed to say, but in my dissertation research where I looked at life satisfaction and what contributes to that, I found a result that is been established pretty much in other people's literature as well, which is that women are happier than men, all things equal. However, women also are more prone to depressive symptoms, and depressed people, unsurprisingly, are less happy too. So, in balance, women are happier, but in my study it was controlling for depression as well. So I guess part of it depends on if you control for mental health conditions that might make you unhappy.
If you look at passengers, you would expect there would be more female passengers than male passengers.
You're absolutely right.
Men drive nearly most of the time, apparently.
I did a whole column about it for Freakonomics. Yeah, I asked the readers why people, who drives in your family and why, and most people said yes, the husband does all the driving. Did I interact? No, I didn't. I did not interact gender and mode. It's just prepared for separately. Yeah, there are many different things that could be done. Dr. Mictarian edited the paper, and I was confessing to her this morning, there's so many more things we could have done. It was like, the second it was published, it was like waking up from a fog in which now I see how many ways I could make it better. But that might be an interesting one as well. What we did find is that, as far as passengers go, is that passenger came out a little happier than driver. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, a little happier than driver. Not even statistically distinguishable though. But a good amount of that happiness came from the fact that they were interacting with another person. So, in other words, most of our drivers were driving alone. Almost all of our passengers were with somebody, hopefully, presumably. And people like being with other people. So when you control for that, liking being with other people, it takes away some of the advantage that passenger has. And we're interested in this because in robocar world, you might have passengers who are alone. So will people enjoy that or not? And as I say, it affected some, it reduced, some, controlling for interaction did reduce some of the happiness. But no, we didn't interact it with gender. Yes, sir?
Back in one of your slides summarizing the existing research, you had one that said that the variability in commuting time alters some of the medical effects.
Yes.
Can you detail more on that?
Yeah. What it theorized, okay, so, and other people in this room probably can tell you better than me, in general, my understanding is that variability is more of a problem for travelers even than travel time. So if people have an hour-long commute that's always an hour long, like, it's easy to get their head around that. Even then, a 50-minute commute, but can vary 20 minutes in either direction. Then you have to leave a reliability buffer, etc. What that study suggested is that they found that longer trips result in more stress, worse emotions, but they think the reason is that longer trips have more scope for variability. So on a 10-minute trip, there's going to be a limited amount you could be delayed, whereas on a 50-minute trip, there's just more scope for accidents and other problems that could delay. So they suspected that that variability is an intervening variable between the travel distance and the bad emotions.
And you don't have the data here to look at whether, say, the availability of that next bus or next train timing information, i.e. the data to say, I know in advance what my commute is going to be today, even if it's different than 3 days ago. You don't have the data here.
You're going to have to do that research yourself. Be sure to send me the results. No, I don't. As everyone knows with their paper, they end with lots of suggestions for future research. There's typically much stuff that's much harder to do than the paper they just wrote, but other people should do that stuff, and I did the easy. No, I haven't, well, there has been work on, Brian Taylor at UCLA did do work about what aspects of the transit stop make for better and worse emotions. It's in Access Magazine. Does anyone here read Access? Yeah, it's really, really great. It's in Access Magazine. It's called Thinking Outside the Bus. And they actually have a really cool thing where they graph different characteristics of bus stops and by their importance and satisfaction levels and look at different things. But I don't think they had next bus arrival sign. They had stuff like restrooms and food nearby and cleanliness and whatever. The most important factors are my bus is reliable and I feel safe. Those are both huge things. Oh, as far as the emotional aspect of a transit trip, safety is gigantic. That is really something, especially when it interacts with wait time. So if you feel unsafe and have a long wait, that's really, really, really bad. People really don't like it. What can we do cheaply to fix safety? Because we don't have the ability to put a traffic cop on each corner. I once, and I'm just about out of time, when I was just getting started as a writer, I wrote an article for Safe Company. It was about how great good safes are, but they also had some other advice. They said the #1 deterrent to crime is good lighting. So maybe if we address bad lighting at bus stops and try to get them better lit, we actually could make people feel safer in a reasonably cost-effective way and improve riders' effective experience that way. Anyway, it's 12 o'clock right now. Should we wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Once again, we're not